we're discussing a very important issue, and I want to begin with the preservation of the Quran. Now, Islam is based on the Quran and the Hadith, but tonight I'm just considering the Quran and its preservation. The preservation of the Hadith would be an important issue, but we won't do that tonight. Now, regarding the preservation of the Quran, we're told that it was a matter of simple dictation, and then it was perfectly memorised and preserved by Muhammad's followers. But there's actually more to it than this. I want to read us from a hadith here from Imam Bukhari, and I'll be quoting from these types of sources tonight. Narrated by Al-Bara, there was revealed, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So from Surah 4, verse 95. The Prophet said, call Zayd for me and let him bring the board and the ink pot and the scapular bone, that is the writing equipment. Then he said, right, not equal are those believers who sit and to those who sit. And at that time, Amir bin Maktam, the blind man, was sitting beside the Prophet. He said, O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me as regard the above verses? I'm a blind man. So instead of the above verse, the following verse was revealed. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled by an injury or blind or lame, and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So we see that there was the first version of the verse, Surah 4, verse 95, and then a later, we could even say an improved version to cover other situations. Now this type of changing of what Muhammad recited happened so often that it made the Meccans comment about it and were critical of him, and it actually evoked a response in the Quran itself. And so we read here, and when we exchange a verse in place of another, and God knows very well what he is sending down, they say to Muhammad, thou art a mere forger. So you can see how this issue of changing what he was saying actually was noticed by those around him, and a verse needed to be revealed. He needed to say a verse to cover this. This shows that the Quran was fluid during Muhammad's lifetime, and its preservation was not simply dictation and memorisation, as certain parts were revised. My next point is that Muhammad never collected the Quran into one volume, and this caused preservation problems. Let me just read to you from the Hadith again, narrated by Zayd bin Thabit. I suggest you, O Abu Bakr, order that the Quran be collected. I said to Umar, how can you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? See, Muhammad never compiled the Quran into a final volume. It was his companions who collected the Quran into one book, but they had memorised the Quran differently. Again, consider this hadith, narrated by Ibrahim. The companions of Abdullah ibn Masud came to Abu Darda, and before they arrived at his home, he looked for them and found them. Then he asked, who among you can recite the Quran as Abdullah recites it? They replied, all of us. He asked, who among you knows it by heart? They pointed at Al-Qama. And he asked Al-Qama, how did you hear Abdullah ibn Masud reciting Surat Al-Layl? Al-Aqma recited, by the male and the female. That's a certain verse from the Quran. Abu Adar said, I testify that I heard the Prophet reciting it likewise, but these people, this is in Iraq, want me to recite it by him who created male and female, and by Allah I will not follow them. You see, Muhammad's companions did preserve the Quran by memorising it, but the Hadith itself testifies to it being memorised differently. These different versions of the Quran began to cause trouble among the Islamic community, and so the third Caliph Uthman solved this problem by burning all of these other versions and making one standard version. We read, Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what he had copied and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscript or copies, be burnt. Now, most of the companions did receive and accept Muhammad's standard version of the Quran. However, not all of them did. And so again we meet Abdullah ibn Masud again. And it says here in the Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Masud reported that he said to his companions to conceal their copies of the Quran. And so they didn't give them up for burning. Now, the differences between these different versions of the Quran was a subject of many of the early scholars of Islam in the classical period. A particular librarian named Abi Yaqub al-Nadim was a librarian who made a catalogue of the Arabic books in the year 377 AH or 987 AD. And in doing so, he actually goes around and collects Qurans from different locations, and he gives different lists of the different surahs that were in them. And he notices that the surahs are in different order and sometimes have extra surahs or fewer surahs. In fact, he makes an entry in his catalogue on this, and the title of the entry is The Books Composed About the Discrepancies in the Quranic Manuscripts. And it goes through all these different main capital cities of the Islamic Empire, and there were 7 books that he lists in his catalogue recording these. When these Islamic scholars are quoted either directly or from later people who use them, we see that they say about these early versions of the Quran that the number of surahs varied between 110 and 111. The order of the surahs were different. Sometimes the verses had different number of words or words in different orders, and they also had a different attitude to the Bismillah and whether or not it was part of the Quran. Therefore, historically, the preservation of the Quran is not as many Islamic leaders tell us. There were different memorised versions of the Quran with different canons of surahs, different numbers, and a standard version was made and the others were burnt. I'd now like to look at the current situation with the Quran. As I quoted before, Christians are often told that the Qurans around the world are absolutely identical. However, this is not the case. There are different versions or readings in the Arabic qira'at of the Quran used around the world. These qira'at are famous recordings of how 10 famous men recited the Quran. If you actually want to read the Quran, you have to read it according to one of these famous reciters. The most popular one is the one standardised by the Islamic Empire, and that is by Imam Hafs. And so this is the one that is used in the majority of the Islamic world. But Warsh, according to the Quran, according to Imam Warsh, is the Arabic Quran used in most of North Africa. And Imam Khaldun's version is in Algeria, and Al-Juri is in the Sudan. But as I said, there are 10 accepted versions. It's often said by Islamic leaders that these different versions are only different in terms of accent. But this is actually not the case. If we just consider chapter 21, verse 4, the top Arabic there is from Warsh. And I'll see how my Arabic goes. It's Kul, Rabi, Yai, Lamu. Something like that, forgive me. And that means, say, my Lord knows. And so in the Warsh transmission, it's God saying say, which is a phrase that is often in the Quran. But in the Hafs transmission, it says, Kala Rabi, Ya'ai Lamu, which is, he said, my Lord knows. This may seem like a small change, but it changes the subject of the sentence from God to Muhammad. There are actually 10 of these versions, as I said before, and there are Qurans you can get, they're not easy to get, which have the variants of all the 10 listed in the margins. And there are over 4,000 differences between these authorised versions. Another difference between these Qurans is the Bismillah. This is the introduction that you read at the beginning of the surahs of the Quran, saying, in the name of Allah the Merciful and the Compassionate. Now, it's interesting that amongst these 10 authorised versions, they don't all accept the Bismillah as actually part of the Quran. And so we read here in this Islamic scholar saying, the readers themselves differ over whether the Bismillah was a verse in Surah Fatiha and the other surahs. Among the readers, Ibn Kathir, Azim and Al-Kazi were the only ones who considered it to be a verse at the beginning of each surah, whereas the others did not. And so the exact knowledge about the Bismillah and whether or not it's actually part of the Quran has not been preserved. Now, the majority of Muslims in practice in the world following the Hafs transmission take this as the first part of the verse of each surah, except Surah 9. But with the Warsh transmission, and actually the majority of the readers, it is just like one of the titles that is put there. It's actually just what is said as a way of introducing it, but not part of the Quran itself. Therefore, there are actually differences between the modern Qurans in various ways. We've also got the ancient manuscripts that we can look at, the manuscripts from the Samarkand manuscript, The new recent discoveries in Sana'a in Yemen, the Bankipur Codex and the Topkapi manuscript in Egypt. Some of these claim to be written by Uthman, others not. But amongst all of them, there are variants to what is in the modern Quran today. And so it is just not true when Islamic leaders say that what they say about the Quran, in that it is perfect and free from any variation and has just come simply to us. But I'm not going to exaggerate it either. I do not believe that the Quran is totally corrupt. I'm not trying to say that. The differences do not change the overall meaning of the Quran, and it seems to be a credible record of what Muhammad recited. What I am asking for, though, is that people, that Islamic leaders in particular, stop exaggerating this point.